thanks so much for joining me. I'm here with Simon Says Stamp, and I'm going to be sharing a card with you featuring the new WPlus9 Holiday Trimmings stamp set. This stamp set is part of the Simon Says Stamp STAMPtember event, and I love the fun, cute little trees that are included in this set. I'm going to be using them to create a watercolor background that features a lot of beautiful shimmer and shine, and I'm going to be sharing some tips and tricks on how you can create some really gorgeous shimmer on your projects. First, let's take a look at the stamp set. Here is the WPlus9 Holiday Trimmings set. You can see it comes with a bunch of little trees and ornaments and some really beautiful sentiments. I love the script font that's included in this stamp set. We're going to be using just the trees today, and I've already die cut my panel from some watercolor paper. This is a Strathmore watercolor panel piece that I have die cut using the Simon Says Stamp stitched oval dies. I'm going to ink up the two trees with Mowed Lawn Distress ink, and I'm going to spritz them with water to get the ink moving. The reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to be creating a watercolor effect with the stamping, so I want to make sure that the ink moves a lot when I go ahead to stamp it down. You can see here it already has that fun wicking texture to it and just really adds a lot of interest to the stamped image. I'll go ahead and stamp the second tree now, doing the exact same technique. When I'm spritzing the stamp with water, I'm spritzing it from about 6 to 8 inches away, and I'm using just one spritz of water because I don't want them to be really wet. I just want them to be wet enough that they're going to move, but yet I still want a little bit of definition. Now this one I stamped a couple times because I'm going to be stamping this over on the far left-hand side, and I want to make sure that the ink moves quite a bit as I press it down because I'm stamping on the edge of the paper, so I want to make sure I got some movement with that ink. I'll go ahead and spritz some water on top of these trees to add a little bit extra texture, and I'll lift off those water spots with my rag. And this gives your trees a little bit more texture and helps them have more of a watercolor feel because the coloring is not a flat, solid color. It instead has a little bit more of a variegated look. Now I'm going to get started on my watercoloring. I'm first drawing out where my snow hills are going to be around these little trees. I'm using a very light color of Zig marker. This is a very pale blue color. I'll have the color listed on the side of the screen for your reference. But I'm just quickly drawing out the snow hills. I'm being very quick and not very defined with the lines because these trees already have a whimsical, kind of handmade feel to them. So I want the rest of the scene to kind of evoke that same feel. So I'm adding shading to the snow using both that light blue color and also some lilac. And the reason I'm using the lilac is because it adds a little bit of shadowing to the ground and helps give that nice aurora feel that the snow has when it's getting to be towards sunset. That nice twilight time period is one of my favorite times of the evening. And I'm going to be using these colors of Zig markers to create that same type of effect in my sky. I want to first create some warm pink colors down towards the bottom. A lot of times when you look at a sunset, you see a lot of warm pink colors towards where the sun is. And then the more nighttime colors I'm going to be adding towards the top. Just as in a real night sky, you have the darker colors up towards the top and the lighter colors down towards the horizon line. So that's what we're going to be working on right here. I'm starting off with light blue, and now I'm bringing in more of that lilac. And those colors are going to bring out the colors that we have in the snow. And you can really see how they start to pop and start to have that realistic effect. I love playing with color like this to create some really fun effects on my watercoloring. I'm drying in between each layer, and this is important because I want to make sure I maintain a good amount of color definition between each color that I'm using. I don't want them to blend completely. I just want them to blend a little bit. So as I'm layering color on top of each other, I'm drying in between each layer to give me that color definition. It's also going to allow me to have some hard and soft edges around my watercoloring, and it's going to add a lot more texture to the sky as well. I'm going to continue adding color to the sky, layering the same colors on top of each other until I get the look that I'm going for. Once I have that sky finished, I'm going to add some more texture to it using some water splatters. I'm just going to spritz on some flicks of color using my distress sprayer, and then I'll go ahead and lift those off. I'll also dry this after lifting the water splatters off just to make sure that my paper is nice and dry. So now it's time to add a bit more shading to the ground to really give some contrast. Contrast is what's going to bring your scene to life, so I want to make sure that I add that contrast to the ground to help give this scene that realistic feel. I'm just basically layering the same two colors that I had used, that light blue and also the lilac color. I continue to layer those on top of each other until I get the intensity that I'm looking for. Once I've done my watercoloring, it's time to do my stamping. Like I said, I really love the script font that's in this stamp set. I'm going to be stamping this one here, which says Love and Joy, along the right-hand side of my panel. I'm using slate gray ink from Simon Says Stamp, and I didn't really want a true black color. I wanted it to be a little bit softer and not quite so intense. But I also want to make sure that it's dark enough that stands off of the trees. So I'm going to stamp the slate gray a couple times using my Misty stamping tool. And that's going to darken up that sentiment just enough to give it that nice slate gray feel, but yet it's not going to get lost where the L meets with the trees on our scene. I'm also going to create some dimension by doing some heat embossing. I'm going to re-stamp back over top of that Love and Joy with some Simon Says Stamp clear ink, and this will allow me to heat emboss with some clear embossing powder over top of my sentiment. This is also a great workaround if you want to do heat embossing in a color but don't have a colored embossing powder. You could stamp in a colored ink first and then go ahead and heat emboss over top of it with clear embossing powder. I'm going to go ahead and melt this embossing powder so that way the sentiment has that nice heat embossed dimension. Next, it's time to add some sparkle to the trees. I'm going to take this little starburst and I'm going to stamp this in some Simon Says Stamp clear ink as well. And I'm going to be using some gold embossing powder to heat set this. Now you may have noticed in the finished pictures that there's actually two starbursts in this scene. The other one is on that second tree, the tall one. I wasn't sure if I wanted to have two when I was initially stamping the first starburst. And I was like, yeah, well, I'll just stamp one for now and see what happens as I go further along. And as I went further along, I decided I did want to add that second starburst in. So you'll see that later on that I went ahead and stamped that onto the second tree. After I heat set that starburst, I'm going to start bringing in some of the ornament stamps. These little dots create some really adorable ornaments, but I actually wanted to kind of make it feel a little bit like snow that was sitting on top of the trees. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp those down on top of each of the trees, and then I'll apply white embossing powder over top, and that will create the look of snow kind of laying on top of the trees, and it adds a nice subtle texture to the trees as well. Now you'll notice those little dots ended up being stamped over top of our sentiment. I just took a dry brush and brushed those off of the sentiment so that way it was nice and clean, and that took care of it. Alright, so the next step was to build this card. You'll see here on the picture that we have this great wood grain texture in the background of our card, and I was creating that using a My Favorite Things background stamp. I'm going to stamp this in some Simon Says Stamp clear ink onto a piece of white cardstock. This white cardstock is cut to an A2 sized card, but I will end up trimming it down in a little while. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and use the A2 size to do my stamping. I'm going to take a piece of scratch paper and lay this on top of my paper as I press it down onto the stamp, which is laying face down onto my desk. I'll remove the paper from the stamp and I'll apply some white embossing powder over top. And this is going to create some white on white embossing. You won't be able to see it initially after I've heat set this, but what we're going to do is I'm going to take some distress ink. And this is some weathered wood ink, and I'm going to start blending this on top of the paper to create a grayish weathered wood kind of look. I found that the best way to get the weathered wood look is to apply the distress ink in random fashion. So in some areas have a very light color tone, and then in other areas have darker color. So as you can see in the finished card, we have some areas of the card base that have darker coloring from that distress ink, and then the rest of the card base has lighter colors, and that gave me a lot more of a realistic look. Then I also want to create this beautiful vellum texture that we have in the background as well. You'll also notice that there's a bit of sparkle on the edges of the vellum, and this was very easy to create, but this adds a lot of interest to the background, helps give some separation from the scene panel from the card base, and also adds a lot of sparkle. So let's go ahead and check that out next. I'm using some Simon Says Stamp vellum. This is a new vellum from Simon, and it's a very high quality. I really love it. I'm going to rip the edges of the vellum, and I'm going to create just a little panel of it. You can see I'm being very random with how I rip this vellum. I want it to look very organic. So I'm going to make sure that I have some areas that have some really deep rips, and then other areas have just some smoother rips. going to take that vellum and apply some Simon Says Stamp Clear ink to the edges of it. This is going to create a sticky edge to our panel and allow us to be able to apply some embossing powder over top of it. That's going to give us a nice frosted look to the edges of the vellum, and I think it really adds to the snowy scene. The embossing powder that I'm using is from Nuvo. This is a gorgeous glitter embossing powder, and I really love the beautiful detail that you get with the powder. I'm going to take the powder and sprinkle it over top of my vellum piece. You can already see all that glitter that is in the embossing powder. Once I've sprinkled the embossing powder over top, I'm going to take my heat gun and heat set that powder. And as it melts, it'll melt to the edges of our vellum, and it'll create this really gorgeous, sparkly, frosted appearance to the vellum. It reminds me of snow crystals laying on a window or something like that. It's really pretty. So this is how it's going to get layered up onto our card. You can see that my card base has been trimmed down. Again, like I said, I didn't want that full A2 sized card, so I ended up trimming it down to be a 4-inch square card panel. I'm going to layer that vellum piece on top of our card base at a little bit of an angle, and then I'm going to take a craft knife and add a slit into my card base, which is going to allow me to feed some ribbon through. The ribbon is going to tie in the blue that we have in our scene and really bring out those blue tones. Because we have a top folding card here, the slit is allowing me to be able to feed the ribbon through to the back side of the card and be able to still be able to open the card. Because if you tried to tie it around the card right now without adding the slit, you'd end up tying the card closed. So I'll go ahead and feed that ribbon through, tie it into a bow, and I'll just play with the bow until I have it looking the way I like. It takes me a little bit to get the bow fiddled into the exact place and into the shape that I'm looking for, but once I have it tied, I'll go ahead and trim that down. I'm also adding a bit of foam tape to the back side of our seam panel, and I'll layer this right into the center area of the card. Next, it's time to add a bit more sparkle. So I'm bringing in my Spectrum Noir Sparkle pen, and I'm going to very carefully apply sparkle to the snow hills. And I'm only adding it to the shaded areas of the snow hills because I want those to be sparkly. But I'm being careful because the Spectrum Noir Sparkle pen will reactivate the watercoloring that we've done on our panel. So I'm being very careful not to move the color too much as I'm applying this. I'm more dabbing the shimmer onto the paper rather than dragging it across the paper because, again, we want the colors to stay the way they are. I don't want to move them, so I want to make sure that I'm careful as I'm applying this down. For some embellishing, I'm going to take some Nuvo Crystal drops and add these to some of the dots on our trees. Now, one thing to remember with Nuvo Crystal drops is that they will reactivate with Distress inks. They don't reactivate with the Zig Clean Color markers, or at least not that I've noticed, but they do reactivate when I have them on top of Distress ink. I wanted the crystal drops to reactivate with the Distress inks that we had used to stamp our trees, but if you don't want that to happen, definitely keep in mind that they will reactivate, so just be careful as you apply these down onto your project. Before I go, I want to show you how beautiful the shimmer looks on this card. You can see the shimmer on the sides of the vellum and also on the snow and the sky. Absolutely beautiful. And this stamp set from WPlus9 is a real winner. Remember that this stamp set is a limited time only set. It's only available during STAMPtember, and once it's sold out, it won't be coming back. So make sure you get yours now while supplies last. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below and head on over to my blog to get more information on this card. If you enjoyed this video, here's another one you might like featuring Simon Says Stamp STAMPtember products. Please give this video a big thumbs up, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and you can connect with me on social media at Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, YouTube, as well as my blog. Thanks so much for watching. I will see you again soon.